Thank you. Senator Fawcett.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I rise to speak on Senator Xenaphon's disallowance motion against the CEO 48 Par 1 Instrument 2013. Just like to correct the record, though, there was dialogue in the previous government, and I commend Minister Albanese, as he was then, for his willingness to engage. And in fact, I remember attending a meeting with Senator Xenaphon, with Minister Albanese's staff, with Minister Truss's staff, with representatives of the Australian International Pilots Association and CASA, talking through this issue at length. And at the end of that, the position that was adopted, certainly by myself, was that the disallowance should not be supported, and certainly now Minister Truss's position was the same. So the comment by the opposition now that we've changed our position is not actually correct, and I'd just like to make that point before addressing in more substance the issue at hand. I do want to commend Senator Xenaphon for his interest and commitment to the aviation industry in Australia, and we've worked very collaboratively on a number of aspects around regulation and other things that affect the viability and safety of aviation. And I do also, again, want to put on record my appreciation for the engagement of both the then Minister and the current Minister around this issue. I have not personally changed my position from when we were in opposition and dealing with this, for the reason that where this brings us to is safer than where we were. I acknowledge that there are still outstanding issues, as Senator Xenaphon has still has highlighted, but as he also highlighted, some of those issues leave us in much the same position than we were previously. Now, that previous position may not have been ideal, but we are in no worse position, and given that in net terms there is an improvement, then I think it is appropriate to adopt those changes, and I'll go through in a little more detail why I take that position. I'd like to talk firstly about the broad context of regulatory reform and then come into a little more detail to 48 Bar 1. The reg reform process, as anyone engaged with the aviation industry in Australia knows, has been long, drawn out and to the point of being dysfunctional because of the length of time and the different strategic approaches that CASA has taken to that reform process, particularly when it comes to the engagement of industry. I have long been an advocate of the approach that the former director, Mr Byron, took, where he argued that industry, as the current subject matter experts in a particular area of operation, are probably best placed to know what will work for them and their sector. And despite the fact that there are some rogue operators in the aviation industry, whether that be people in workshops or people operating airlines or charter companies, the vast majority of operators have invested hugely personally in terms of their shareholders. They have a huge incentive to make sure their operations are safe, because if they have an accident, gaining insurance, gaining contracts, particularly if you're operating in a contract environment with the resources sector, almost becomes impossible for an airline. Once you have an accident, then re-attracting customers is difficult, and so people have a huge incentive to get that right. And I'm a great believer that industry should be leading in the development of both regulations and standards in conjunction with the regulator, and only if there is a safety case that the regulator can prove, should the regulator discard the industry's position. Now, I'm aware that certainly CASA's point of view is that this 48 Bar 1 involved working groups with industry and scientific experts, but I'd have to say the track record of engagement with industry has not been a wholesome one for CASA, in that many times it appears to be a one-way process where they might even listen, but they don't take due regard, or in some cases they just transmit about what they're planning to do and call it consultation. Now, there are examples where it has worked well, but there are many where it hasn't, and so this is one area where we fundamentally need to reform the process, not only at the drafting stage, But importantly, as Senator Xenaphon has highlighted, often once a regulation comes into force, there is very little appetite to revisit it for an extended period of time. And so as we look at our regulatory reform process, not only does industry need to have a stronger voice up front in setting those regulations and the manual of standards that goes with it, but there also needs to be a review mechanism where, if there are outstanding issues, there is an opportunity, a framework for industry to have quick and effective remedy to those situations. And Senator Xenaphon mentioned the expert panel that was discussed at the meetings we had last year with then Minister Albanese's staff and Minister Truss's staff and CASA and the industry body. And that concept, but in a more structured framework, is something that I'm very much pushing for as part of the review of aviation safety and regulation, and also in discussions with the current Minister's office about in regard to CO 48.1. The review that is being conducted by David Forsyth, I think, has terrific potential to reform how industry and the regulator engage, and a key part of that that we've seen legislation just introduced in the Parliament by the government is reforming the role of the board so that we have people on the board with aviation experience, and that board's role really does need to be one of governance as opposed to a hands-off oversight, so that they are setting a strategic direction for the regulator that goes to the culture of the regulator, whether it's a big R policeman with a big stick regulator or how far along the spectrum to an educator and supporter. That balance in the middle needs to be a strategic decision. So regardless of who the director of the regulator is, we see a consistent approach that industry can plan for, engage with, and will keep the industry not only safe but viable in terms of the cost basis they have to meet. And there are many costs associated with changing regulation. Which brings me to 48.1 and this disallowance motion. As I've stated, overall it is safer, and in the areas where there are points of contention, we are no worse off than we were. If we were worse off in significant areas, then clearly there is a case to reject the regulation. But if we are no worse off and in other areas we are better off, then we are better served, the travelling public and the industry is better served in finding a way to effectively and quickly review and modify those areas of concern. Senator Xenaphon mentioned the window of circadian low, and whilst I've never been a long-haul pilot, I've had many years of flying what we call reverse cycle operations, where we fly by night, and in the military's case often using night vision equipment, which brings in fatigue issues of its own. And so I'm well aware, and I am concerned by the fact that we have had a grandfathering of that 5 a.m. start point into these regulations. But if we are no worse off than we were before, that is something that should be reviewed as opposed to rejecting the whole package out of hand. The position that I'm taking on this, and certainly the government's position, is to not support the disallowance, but I'm working with the Minister's office to make sure that once we have rejected this, we also, and part of the reason for that is that because many industry players, since it was introduced in April of 2013, they've got a transition window to 2016, many of them have already invested in changing how they work to meet the new regulation. And as I said, change does not come cheap to industry players, and I think that not only are we going a step backwards in safety if we adopt this disallowance, but we are disadvantaging those industry players who have invested in adopting the new regulations. What I'm seeking to do is to make sure that we have, in a very timely manner, the opportunity for the concerned parties in industry, and I know both the Virgin Pilots Association and the Qantas Group APA have raised concerns, predominantly the long-haul pilots, for them to help select subject matter experts who can form this independent panel to review these specific areas of concern, and then have them as the independent umpire to bring a recommendation back to the Minister so that he can then work with the regulator to address those concerns in a timely manner. I think the outcome of the review being led by David Forsyth, I am hoping, and obviously I can't speak for them nor the recommendations they will bring forward, but having met with many players from the aviation industry in both maintenance and manufacturing, engineering and in operations, I'm aware that this is one of the critical things that we need, is a system whereby industry can have timely remedy to decisions of the regulator that have a material impact on their business and where the safety case is disputed by industry. And so whilst hopefully the remedy for this won't necessarily be part of the broader regulatory reform and a change of structure, it may be a test case of how that could work, which may then start forming the ideas around how we adopt the broader regulatory system and the opportunity for industry to have that timely remedy. So, Mr Acting Deputy President, the government won't be supporting the disallowance. I maintain the same position I've had since I was in opposition on this, that in net terms we are better to adopt the new 48.1, but that there is a need to have that independent panel to work with industry and the regulator to review the points of concern and come up with an agreed position that we can quickly amend that part of the regulation that needs changing.